Woohoo!
We've been spending a lot of time talking about beliefs and just analyzing us, the instrument.
Some would even say too much time.
We've kind of described this as philosophical conversations between a father and a daughter.
Yeah.
What does philosophy mean to you?
Well, it's like basically trying to answer the questions of life, or trying to figure out new questions to ask about it.
I like that definition because it talks about life.
Mm-hmm.
I want to create a distinction between two kinds of philosophy. One is what exists. And that role of philosophy has largely been taken over by the natural sciences.
Yeah.
The second part of philosophy, though, is to describe what life should be. How should we live?
Yeah.
And as you can probably guess, that gets into moral philosophy. I want us to step away from talking a little bit about what is and talk a little bit today and maybe in the next couple episodes about what should be. What to you is the good life?
Well, the good life would be like, it would be like the best life you can live, both for you and other people.
I want to talk about the virtues from a philosophical standpoint. And that is a lover of wisdom, someone who's looking to lead a good life. Since we're starting ancient, let's go back a little bit. I assume that you've heard of the 7 deadly sins.
Yeah.
Right? Like
Yeah.
That's sort of an ancient concept, right? But did you know that there are correspondingly
The 7 virtues.
7 virtues? What I want to do today is let's step through the 7 deadly sins. Let's step through the 7 corresponding heavenly virtues. And let's apply the good life test to them. The first set of sins and virtues are pride and humility.
Pride is interesting to me because it's like it doesn't really seem that bad at all to me. I mean, it's like obviously if anything is taken to a super huge extent, like if you're constantly like bragging about everything in your life, then that would be bad. But it's like pride to me is just being proud of what you have. It's like seeing what you have achieved and like admiring what it took to get there.
So, for you, what would the corresponding virtue of humility be then?
Humility, it's kind of like being modest, right? It's like you are sort of staying quiet about your achievements and not looking for any sort of validation from anyone else for achieving good things. And honestly, I don't think that's not one of the most important things ever. It's okay to have worked hard on something and then want other people to acknowledge that you've worked hard on that thing.
I think you've just done a fantastic job of describing the modern conception of the way that we use the words pride and humility. And I think that they are not the way that they were used in a historical context.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So, as we've discussed belief and how we judge beliefs and how we analyze beliefs, we've talked about one of the biggest problems being our natural self-centeredness.
Yeah.
When we talk about pride in the historical context, it's very much that second kind of self-centeredness, whereby you don't believe that anyone else's opinions matter. Can you understand how that would be seen as something negative from a philosophical standpoint?
Yes, no. That is definitely negative, because I was talking about how pride can be fine in moderation, and you were like, well, this idea of pride is actually the very opposite of that.
Right. So talk to me a little bit about someone who was proud in the sense of only believing that their thoughts and opinions matter would affect their ability to judge the world correctly?
Well, it would definitely affect their ability to judge the world very negatively, because they would be completely unable to actually like get any correct view on the world. Because we were talking about because like there's no peer review, there's no sources. You are just every thought you think you believe must be true, and generally thoughts aren't very reliable.
Particularly since we talked about how contingent our early thoughts are.
Yeah.
Right? That they just come from whatever historical context and parental context that we come from. And so if you just blindly believe just because it's you and it comes from you that it must be right, you can see how that would lead to grave error in judgment.
It would be like the worst toddler ever, just endlessly throwing a temper tantrum.
Humility isn't downplaying your strengths. It is taking yourself completely out of the picture and looking at things accurately. Can you understand that the classical sense of humility versus the modern day conception of humility? And
Yeah.
different?
Yeah, no, I get that. The modern day humility is just constantly downplaying everything about you. It's just always being self-deprecating, but kind of like the previous form of humility, like the old definition of humility, is just kind of looking at your traits and just the rest of the world in general at a purely objective standpoint, or as objective as you can get.
Pride, that is taking a self-centered view regardless of what reality is telling you, really could be the greatest sin.
Yeah.
And humility, that is taking an objective view of the world, in spite of how it makes you look or anyone else look, could really be a great virtue, particularly for the philosophical enterprise.
Yeah, no, that is sort of what philosophy is all about. It's like trying to get an objective, it's trying to get like the right answers about the world.
So let's talk about another pair of vices and virtue. The second vice is greed.
Yeah.
Do you know what the corresponding virtue is classically?
Generosity?
Close. Charity.
Yeah.
And traditionally, I think that it means very much closer to generosity. Let's once again evaluate those two in terms of the good life, right? Those real virtues or those made-up virtues?
I think greed, it seems pretty similar to selfishness, just like in a few ways. Just in the way as in like, hey, like I want all of this, which is like greed, like for myself, and then selfishness is like just caring about yourself and not other people. Like that's a bad trait, right? Yeah, that's a bad trait.
Well, so we say it's bad, but does it lead to a bad life?
My definition of a good life was like making yourself happy and making other people happy. And greed, it can, in some ways, it would make you happy, because like if you have everything, then you're gonna be happy. You're gonna have a bunch of like things to mess around with. But it would definitely not make other people happy, because like you're hoarding everything so they don't get anything. And then also I would argue that it would also be unhappy for yourself to not have any people around you, because greedy people don't have anyone and are not going to have anyone in their lives that genuinely care about them and that they genuinely care about in return.
You bring up two fantastic points about greed and the good life. The first is, greed is very similar to our definition of pride. It's a kind of self-centeredness.
Yeah.
And then secondly, it's a misperception of the world and happiness. Because essentially what it is at its core is valuing things over relationships.
Yeah.
And ultimately, is valuing things over relationships a path to happiness or the good life?
No.
Not, right? So, talking about its corresponding virtue, charity, or as we described it as generosity, Talk to me a little bit about what that is.
So it's just about like sharing things in your life with other people. Generosity, for normal people that are not giving everything away, is I would see it as a positive thing, because you're giving away, you're sharing your things with other people, and which definitely like improves your relationships with other people. It also makes people like around you happier. Like, there's the happiness that comes from gift giving, because you care about these people and these gifts make them happy. So giving them these gifts makes them happy, and then seeing them happy makes you happy because you care about them.
And step back and think about how generosity is actually just a correct looking at the world. Because in a couple of ways. One, it's you stepping outside of yourself and understanding that although hoarding things does make me happy because I like things,
Yeah.
that the relationships with other people are ultimately more fulfilling than the things themselves.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't argue that relationships with people are strictly more fulfilling than things. I mean, some of these things are pretty great.
Ultimately, if you talk to people on their deathbed, the things that they say that they should have done more is spend time with friends and family. There are not very many people who say on their deathbed, I wish I would have hoarded more shit for myself.
Just playing devil's advocate here. I think that things make me pretty happy, and like people also make me happy. But just being like, oh, relationships are instantly way more fulfilling than things ever could be, and like generosity is the ultimate thing ever, is just untrue. And the reason a lot of people say that on their deathbeds is, because relationships with people are pretty great, but also because they were probably like assholes in their life that didn't spend any time with people because they were just greedy all the time.
I feel like as you look back on life, the things you remember with joy are the relationship. But I totally take your point.
Yeah.
You can't overstate it. Things are important. Here's a question for you. We have more than most people here in Belize.
Yes.
And I think that we've come about what we have fairly. But it still stands to back that we have more than most people. Are we greedy? I guess what I'm trying to ask is the capitalist system, which our privilege is a product of, inherently greedy?
It's not to say that you haven't worked that, but the system in which you worked in for that was fundamentally flawed, and you probably got an advantage from like where you were born in, luck, being a white man. Like, you got a lot of stuff going for you. So it's not that you haven't worked for this, it's that other people have worked just as hard and not gotten anywhere near to what you have achieved, because the system is ultimately flawed.
The reason I ask the question is I think about it sometimes. Because, there are a lot of people who, particularly now, young people, and, I'm very much on the side who decry capitalism as inherently unjust.
It is.
And yet I don't see many of those people giving up what capitalism has given.
Yeah. Well, part of that is that it can be really hard to. Like, both that it can seem like pointless to do this all when capitalism is going to be reigning on, which is ultimately a mindset that is not going to help anyone. It can be really hard both to give up your things mentally, like, I don't want to give up the thing because I like this thing, but also just actually once you've overcome the mental barrier to actually give up those things.
For sure. And I think it's interesting that if we polled most Americans and talked about the vice of greed and the virtue of generosity, they would agree that those are real vices and real virtues. But if you then ask them to lower the United States standard of living, to equalize it with the rest of the world so that it was more egalitarian, I think most Americans would have a hard time doing that.
As I was talking about greed, I was thinking to myself how it's actually.
When you think about that, it could be as simple as a matter of voting one way or the other. Or it
Yeah.
could be as simple as literally pushing a button and transferring your luxury bank account into a charitable bank account. It's actually incredibly possible in this world. At this very moment, if any human being wanted to, in the modern Western world, they could do it in a matter of hours. Make that decision, that life decision. But I don't think that many human beings would.
Okay. I feel like, wow.
Kind of nuts, right? Kind of
Yeah,
interesting.
I feel like it was giving rich people too much like benefit of the doubt.
Conservatives, I think, would fairly make the argument that people who are billionaires in the United States are playing by the same rules as everyone else. And I kind of tend to agree with that. But the way that we treat billions of dollars in income via our taxation system doesn't fully acknowledge or properly acknowledge is how much of that value creation was dependent on the infrastructure, the laws, the roads, the postal service, everything that is part of society that we all share together.
You're like, oh, like they would somewhat fairly say, yeah, like we worked hard for this money, like they worked hard for this money, like everyone worked hard for the money, and we did under like the same rules as everyone else. It's not true. Because they were doing it under completely different rules as everyone else. Because the rules are entirely dependent on like where you were born, what situation you were born in, your parents. Like you're entirely dependent on like your race, your gender, all of these factors, all of these million factors make it so much easier for certain people to be successful and so much harder for certain people to be successful in the way that they could have worked.
No one's arguing that everyone starts from the same place. I don't think anyone would make that argument. Everyone knows that I come from a more privileged background. You come from a more privileged background.
Yes.
But I don't think that you would find it fair if we set in place a bunch of rules that penalized you for the position you were born into, would you?
You still have to acknowledge that these rules are biased in people's favor. It's like the rules of the game are, okay, you work hard, you go to college, you get a degree or something, or maybe you go straight past that and go to work. You work, you like apply for a job somewhere, you get a job, you work somewhere, you work hard, you get your money, etc., etc., etc. But all of these factors are biased in people's favor because depending on your race and your gender and other factors that you cannot control besides the financial state you were born in, it can be harder. It can be harder to get an education. It can be harder for people to accept you on job applications.
Right, and I think that sort of a moderate view in the modern American political system would be that those factors that disadvantage you, aside from economic factors, which are ostensibly under your family's control, should be adjusted for in terms of giving you more opportunity to succeed. And yet, neither you nor I, maybe at least you, I don't know, has taken any action to mitigate that injustice, or would be willing to give up what we have in order to make things fairer.
Yeah, well, like, what would you like? How would we give up what we have to help others?
We're gonna take a 6-week vacation this summer. That vacation, all totaled together with your camps and what your mom and I are going to do and flying around and doing whatever, could easily cost $30,000 to $40,000. What do you think that $40,000 US could do in the community of Hopkins for the people here?
A lot.
A lot, right? So are you willing to not go on your vacation this summer?
Yes.
Should we do it?
If you want to like somehow like put those $40,000 into like something that helped Hopkins, then yeah, sure, I'd be willing to do that.
Well, then I guess that if you really, really were willing to do that, then I guess you passed the test. That you are a generous person and not greedy. And maybe that's the good life.